Hello and welcome to the Brains podcast with your host, me, Michal. Today, I am joined by Jose Antonio del Valle Torres, where we'll be diving into entrepreneurship, business growth, and the realities of building something from the ground up. Jose, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Michal. Thank you for having me here.
You're so welcome. How are you?
Very well, actually. And as I said, very, very excited to be here with you.
Nice. I'm excited for this conversation, but I'd love to start with the wider lens because your work really seems to sit at the intersection of, let's say, business, society, and systems. When you look at today's world, what do you see as some of the biggest tensions between local democracies and the realities of global capitalist structures?
I think we're at a moment, Michal, and for the last years, maybe for the last decades, where definitely an integration is meant to happen between the local aspects, the local law, the local culture, the local geographics, and the global aspects of things. And I think for the better, but at the same time, there are enormous challenges because when we live in a global capitalist world, and by the way, I'm a globalist and I'm a capitalist being an entrepreneur, and I think there's only everything to win about that. But the problem is when it's not well aligned, we are striving in a world where the weaker one will always tend to lose. And that's something we need to look at and something we need to start addressing before it's too late.
Jose, we often hear language around freedom and opportunity and open markets, but the lived reality can feel very, very different depending on who holds the power. Where do you think local communities and smaller voices are maybe most vulnerable within the larger global systems?
To be fair, I think everywhere. I mean, obviously, the problem magnifies in the countries that are less developed, that have less structured institutions, just because the system fails the least favored or the poor in the human struggle. But then when you take that to the more developed countries, and especially these days, again, as we were speaking at a time where capital seems to be everything, then the risk could be everywhere. So I think with a global mindset, again, we need to start looking at global rules, at global ways, at global forms of interaction where integration is the key.
I think what you've just said is especially important for entrepreneurs because there's often this narrative that innovation and hard work is all you need, it's always enough. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest myths that's surrounding real and sustainable entrepreneurial support?
It's so challenging. In the speech, in the narrative, it sounds always beautiful. Let's support entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurial fair supported with public funds. Apparently an openness from the global corporations to meet with entrepreneurs, but the reality is very different. I think greed tends to step in many aspects of life, and especially in the business world, which many times, unfortunately, it's about greed and it's about profit. And there's nothing wrong with profit. The challenge with profit is when you put it first and nothing else matters, this comes at a risk, Michal, because then the person behind the intellectual property will always be at risk. If he doesn't have the structure, if he doesn't have the capital, if he doesn't have the means to develop his idea or to take it to the next level, most likely he will end up in a bad place. His idea will end up nowhere. It will be bought by an unfair price, or he could end up being cheated by a bigger player.
On the surface, there is a lot of celebration around entrepreneurship, right? But behind that, the structures are meant to support people. They're not always as strong or as accessible as they may appear, like we recently just touched on. But what do you think is often missing from the conversation when we talk about supporting founders in a more meaningful way?
Let me put it this way, Michal. I was seeing a statistic this morning where 20% of the new businesses, of the newcos, they fell within the first 2 years, 50% within the first 5 years. And by year 7, you talk of 80 to 90% of the new companies failing. So something is clearly failing. I think entrepreneurship and innovation is key for the progress of society. That has been everything from the beginning, from the human being learning how to use fire. It was innovation. So for society to benefit, governments to progress, The innovation and the entrepreneurship is key. But then when the number is so big of new companies failing, something is wrong. And what I believe is wrong is, again, it's a bit of a speech. It's a bit of how I take advantage. It's a bit of what's to gain here, rather than the accompaniment to the inventor. So unless we start putting greed a little bit on the side and by the way, everyone loses, because this inventor, one idea goes nowhere, someone takes it, and then the talent of this person is compromised. So I think there needs to be significant support for innovation, but in an honest, in an ethical, and in a structured way to incentivize innovation all over the world.
Another big theme of your work is what happens when the rule of law is challenged by the weight of corporatism and influence. In your view, what does that tension reveal about the legal frameworks that many people assume are there to protect things like fairness?
I mean, I have my own story and my own case against one of the most iconic global multinationals for the last 8 years, where the only thing you do not see is justice or fairness in any way. So addressing the question, I believe the challenge is that, again, the human factor steps in, and even when the narrative seems profoundly righteous and romantic, it's enough to see the corruption indexes in the different countries around the world. And that answers the question on itself. If it's a very corrupt country, then justice will never be served. The less powerful party will always be challenged and will never find the right path. And even in countries with low indexes of corruption, there is still corruption. It's a low index, but there is still corruption. And the problem is, maybe there is not corruption everywhere and at every level, but the problem is when it is a significant matter, corruption does step in. And without going into any further examples or details, it's enough to analyze all the significant corruption scandals all around the world happening in the news this morning, the last week, the last year. And I would leave this question to the audience. Is justice being made in those significant cases? And it's an open question.
When powerful corporate interests begin to shape or pressure the systems around them, Jose, whether it's legal, whether it's political, whether it's economic, what do you believe is most at risk for the ordinary person, the ordinary citizen, smaller businesses, or even democratic trust itself?
Absolutely everything. I lost my country, I lost my family, I lost my business. Friends of mine passed away in the middle of COVID, or other situations in the middle of this story that I'm dealing with. So everything is put at risk. And I think here the invitation to turn this into a positive matter, the invitation is that the powerful one, the multinationals, or even the powerful individual, and we are all powerful to some extent, and we are all weak to another extent. So in our own reality, we need to behave, and we need to set an example. Because if the stronger party uses the power to damage the opposite party, basically what we're doing here is we're going back to year one and the law of the jungle and see who's stronger. And I don't think anyone wants a world like that.
Absolutely not. I think many people still want to believe that institutions will always act independently, right, and justly, but that's not always how reality plays out. What have you come to understand about the gap between legal principle and legal practice when power enters the room that you're in?
It gets completely compromised. And the reason being is, sadly, many of these institutions, the independent ones, right? They depend on funding, for example, or they have board of directors. And here is where the conflict of interest happens. Who's funding that institution? If it is a matter of money, right? And if it is a matter of the board of directors, which are the other jobs or roles that these individuals serve? And who has the power over that? And then you get to a point where you see that a lot of it is absolutely compromised. And when we speak of government, sadly, I'm being very honest, the problem seems to be these days, and now it's more graphic than ever, that many of the politicians obviously come from political parties, and those political parties and those campaigns need funding. So where is the funding coming from? How much vigilance is appearing towards that funding? And then when you mix the interests, the capital, and the multiple jobs of the individuals running the institutions, it's very complex, because then the greater authority or the greater interest will mix in the middle of that. And the sad thing, Michal, is that then the principles get compromised. Justice, democracy, access to the law, it all gets compromised. Maybe not in smaller matters, but in the bigger matters, and I am a witness to it, it can all get compromised, sadly.
In conversations like this, it can be very easy to stay at this level of critique maybe, but your perspective always seems to point towards the responsibility of the individual or at the individual's level. Why do you believe that it's individual awareness that's such an important starting point to create maybe just a broader change?
Because it all starts with the individual. In the end, corporations are individuals, governments are individuals, institutions are individuals. And it only takes one good individual to have an impact on a number of other individuals. But again, the challenges are the interests, the funding, and the multiple interests of the individual. So I don't believe, being realistic, that we will ever see a utopic scenario or a profoundly romantic one. But I think the invitation here is that each and every individual, actually this is an individual invitation, not a collective one, and it's a matter of reflection, hopefully for your audience and for every person that listens to us. It's a matter of a personal exercise of reflection of how can I, as an individual, can I have the higher and the better impact on whatever it is that I'm doing. And I believe with these little ripples of hope or these little actions multiplied by the millions of individuals, then a different reality is built. And that's what we have to aim for.
So you're speaking about individual awareness, and you often speak about individual awareness integrating into social support structures, which is a very compelling idea. Can you unpack what that means in practice, and why do you believe personal awakening on its own is not enough without the collective structures around it or without you?
So again, a little bit, I can always speak better from my reality, right? And we had a very challenging situation where my case was meant to be analyzed by the Congress of my country. And the president of Congress addressed the matter, but his response was profoundly sad. He basically said, sir, we don't have a commission of truth in the Senate, so then we cannot look at this. So you're talking about a legislative body of one of the most significant countries in the world who cannot address truth because there's no commission of truth. And then if there's no truth in the higher chamber of a significant country, what is their law without truth? That's very incoherent. So I believe, again, the individual has to become aware of the personal challenges, the neighborhood challenges, the society or the national challenges, and the global challenges. And what needs to happen here is more interaction and more coming together through structures, through groups, but on a global scale or on a continental scale, where voices can be heard. And then these commissions of truth can be created in the hopes of a better place. But then the question is, do we really want a better place? Because sometimes it seems we want it when we are the ones being affected, but when we are the ones to win, sometimes it seems we don't want it. And that goes anywhere from crossing the street to creating national legislation. So again, the invitation is a personal one. It's a personal exercise of how I've been impacted as a person and why then I should not be impacting negatively other realities. And only through that reflection across time in multiple efforts can a change happen. Anybody that comes and promises in a political speech a profound change overnight, I think we're all bored of it, to be honest. Like we've been seeing, I mean, I've been listening to it for decades, and it happens to a certain extent, but if we were to do an exercise of the political campaign speech versus the outcome and the reality, it would be a very interesting statistic, which I think is hardly ever met.
Jose, when people start to become more aware socially, ethically, and politically, there can still be this sense of powerlessness if there's no system in place that holds awareness and turns it into, let's say, an action. What kind of support structures do you believe need to be added the most if we want awareness to turn into real progress going forward?
I could give you a very romantic answer, but I won't, which would follow what we have now, which is these independent organisms and all the rest. But we already discussed the challenges there, right? With the funding, with the directors who might have a conflict of interest with their other roles in society. So I think, and this is a bit of an exotic idea, but I'm going to give it over to you, and hopefully something comes out of it. I think the exercise needs to happen from the most powerful players. And I mean the most powerful governments. I mean the most powerful corporations. They need to really understand the responsibility they have, not to take advantage, not to exercise power for the sake of gaining more. And again, I'm no one to challenge here the system. I believe in globalism, I believe in capitalism, I believe in progress. But once that is happening, how can we make it happen in the most ethical way, in the most conscious way? So it's not about putting more regulation there to limit progress. It's not about putting more regulation there to limit the individual. This has already happened across time, and it didn't work. Eventually, all that fell to the ground. But what's valuable of those schemes that fell is that at least there seemed to be an awareness towards the collective benefit. So I think if in a very honest decision and exercise of and a determination, right, to create a better society, a better world, the powerful players got creative, got innovative, keeping the agenda. But how can we create a social benefit? Not in numbers, not in reports, but in reality. Without an interest to keep the poor poor and the damaged. Because, by the way, everyone will benefit from a more prosperous world. That's a fact. There will be a higher consumption power. There will be a higher need for things. The moment the individuals are better educated, there will be better innovation. So it seems we've been stuck in competing and destroying. How about we get stuck in participating, collaborating, and building? And that would create a different society.
I agree. And if we're thinking about global success in a way that maybe feels more human, maybe more sustainable, or maybe more future facing, what do you think needs to change in how we define success itself, both individually, but like you said, collectively as well?
It has to be about happiness in the end. And that's a very personal choice. That's a very personal experience, because what makes you happy doesn't necessarily make me happy. But I think the successful society and the perfect society is one that allows equal opportunities for the individual to achieve that happiness. So it's not economic, it's not measured in metrics. Of course, all of that needs to be there. But I think success will come when you and me had the same possibility to be happy, whatever it is that we decide to do with that. And that's unrelated to money, that's unrelated to profession, that's unrelated to choices. It's basically what makes me happy as an individual, and that I can pursue that within the society that I'm living in.
Nice answer. And Jose, when we bring all these themes together, when we're talking about entrepreneurship, when we're talking about democracy, when we're talking about awareness, law, power, and even social responsibility, what is the bigger message you want most people to take away about how we build a together and a more brighter, balanced future?
Personal awareness. And I don't want to get spiritual here or philosophical, but it is true. It is true, because as far as we see it again and again in the most horrendous and terrific stories of the history of the nations and of the history of humanity. The more harm has been caused by individuals who are dealing with unresolved traumas from childhood, perhaps. So I think it's about the awareness that I will only be better if everyone else is better off. And again, I'm not against competition. I'm not against free market. All of that is fine. But the way I would summarize it is a bit what I said before. It cannot be at the cost of all the negative aspects of the human being. Destruction, cheating, taking the other lane to bypass you. It has to be about coming together. And a great example would be sports, right? People compete there in the stadium, in the field, but it's in good spirit. And someone wins, and someone's better, but it's in good spirit. So again, it might sound a bit philosophical, but we really need to pick up the good spirit, because otherwise it's just a bit scary what we're seeing currently in many aspects of the news as we speak.
I agree. And Jose, something we ask everybody on the Brains podcast is, what mindset do you credit most for your success?
I think it's gratitude. In such a challenging situation like the one I face, and not to go into details of that, but it's a public story, of course. It has to be gratitude. It has to be gratitude towards the Creator, towards life, towards the people that gave you a hand, towards the people that paid for your education, towards the friends that gave you the best advice. Because when things get very tough, sometimes it's beyond you to continue. But love is the strongest force in any reality. And if you connect with that in a sense of gratitude, of memory, towards all those who have meant something in your life, you will just keep going. And if you keep the good spirit, as I said before, something positive has to come out of it in any given way whatsoever.
And given, you talked about the story, etc., if there's anyone or any business, any individual that experiences that and doesn't know where to turn or what to go, what would you say or what advice would you give them?
A very basic one. Turn inside, look inside, find the truth, and follow it.
So to wrap up, anybody who's listening to this, anybody who's watching this, what's the main takeaway you want them to leave with?
Hopefully that they find the time to look at the narrative I've been dealing with, not because it's about me, but somehow that it serves as some kind of example of determination, perseverance, the search for truth, and that this causes some kind of inspiration, a minor, a medium one, a major one. But I think that's the biggest role we have in society and as human beings, to inspire each other in any given way. And we do not need to think too much about it, but connecting to what I said before, when you look inside, when you find the truth, that's the greatest force, and that truth and living by it hopefully sets the flame all the time in an interaction way, but that we all end up lighting each other.
Nice. You really, I like how you talk about the community and love and gratitude. I think we can forget that sometimes, right? We think there's something else, another answer, but it's all there.
But that's exactly the problem. And then we go back to everything we've chatted about in the podcast. When all that is forgotten, when all that is lost, then nothing could be left in a given period of time. And if we're just focused on that, then sadly we won't build much, because we will just be too busy loving each other. So it just has to be the right balance and the right mix for everyone. And ideally the right balance and the right mix as a collective society, always remembering that we are one society. And if an entity, a person, a part of that body, of that global society suffers, we all suffer.
I just really like how when you're talking, there's a big focus on people and love and community, etc.
So exactly that. And I think you guys are doing a great job. I was telling one of your teammates, and she's aware, that when I got the invitation to participate in Brains and support it, which was more than a year ago, I said yes, just because I'm an entrepreneur. I love entrepreneurial projects. I think you guys had something great going on. And I decided to support it, but I never took anything out of it until this moment. And even now, I didn't really want it to be about me or about my story. I could have said a lot, about the story, or maybe talk negatively about the adverse party. But for me, the most important thing about this conversation was really to leave a positive message. And even when it can sound romantic or philosophical, to rescue that. Because once you enter the corporate building, once you enter the office, once you start looking at the Excel sheet, it seems like we shift between two parallel realities that do not interact, and we need to make them interact, and that's the message I hope to leave.
Thank you for this. This has been eye-opening, very informative, and very educational. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us on the podcast.
It's been all my pleasure, Michal, anytime.
Thank you.